How are you doing, Laura?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks. Good to see you all here.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to this third installment of the Biographies of Interwar Isms series. I'll keep my remarks super short. The series is co-organized by the GloBio Working Group, the New Diplomatic History Network, the Center for Modern European Studies at the University of Copenhagen, and the Department of International History at the London School of Economics. The idea behind the series is very simple. We want to present innovative uses of the biography as a prism to explore the many isms of the interwar period, bridging its 19th century roots and its 20th and 21st century legacies. And today we are delighted to welcome Professor Christine Philliou from UC Berkeley to give a lecture based on her latest book, both entitled Turkey, A Past Against History. To guide us through the discussion and questions following the lecture, we are equally delighted to welcome Dimitris Kamouzis, researcher at the Center for Asia Minor Studies in Athens, Greece. I should say before we start that the lecture is being recorded. So with this, I hand the word over to you, Christine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Håkon. And thank you in advance to Dimitri for giving the response. I am really grateful to be invited to this for many reasons. And one reason is that it has forced me to think in a slightly different framework about the book and about the project, because I hadn't quite thought of the book in the context of the interwar period and the issues, or of isms necessarily, although there are many isms that we can bring in. So I thought before I lay out the kind of premise and argument and layers of the book, I guess I would just touch on a couple possible connections with this broader theme. And I thought, I guess the question of the extent to which Turkey as a state formation is an interwar story to begin with, right? That I think we could talk about for days. We might get a start on that today. And I was in isms, I was thinking in a kind of way, the creation of Turkey, or the circumstances that gave way to Turkey, and this whole story that I'm telling in the book is taking place in this space between constitutionalism of the 19th and early 20th century and self-determination, a new language that's emerging out of World War I and Wilsonianism, right? And I think, as we'll see, this conflict, it's not a complete binary opposition, but there are these disjunctures between these two spheres of ideas and politics. And I think that might be a productive language in which to see both the small rivalry, the small conflict that I talk about between the main character of the book and Mustafa Kemal, and the larger ideas that are kind of invoked in that confrontation. So put those things out there, and we can think about them as I now talk about the specifics of the book. I guess my motivation was to try to understand the evolution, the sort of the transition from the Ottoman Empire to Republican Turkey, and the evolution of politics therein, by both starting from the 19th century and moving forward, and starting from the contemporary understandings of politics and sort of the culture of politics in Turkey and going back. And I hopefully I was successful at that. And the argument of the book is, or the premise and the argument is, that in the absence of a sustained opposition party, a sustained and sanctioned opposition party in the late Ottoman period and in Republican Turkey between 1908 and 1946 to 50, the concept of muhalefet, which I'll talk about in a moment, this concept actually served as a surrogate for an actual institutionalized opposition party. This concept was actually more than just a concept and a word. It, as I try to show in the book, it was almost an arena of discourse, rhetoric, politics, and conflict. So it is not it's not a consistent field in itself, this sphere of politics, because it actually is the sphere where there are these conflicting needs and claims about constitutionalism, liberalism, republicanism, democracy. So I chose this concept to get at, in kind of a transverse way, to get at a lot of these contradictions and conflicts in Turkey. Now, so I guess, you know, what I noticed living and doing research in Turkey was that a lot of the conversations in the contemporary era are about what Turkey lacks, or what Turkey lacked, and why it didn't develop in whatever, some normative way to create a fully consolidated liberal democracy. And I guess rather than take that tack, what I was interested in doing here is looking instead at what it had. What unique features, actually positive features, did develop instead of just what was missing. So that I think that leads in interesting directions. Now, this muhalefet, which literally means, for those who haven't read the book or who are not Turkish, it literally means what we would say in English, both opposition, like partisan opposition, and dissent, which is a more diffuse concept and can be practiced on an individual level. It has kind of a unique connotation in Turkish today, I think. A muhalif, or an opposition figure or a dissenter, is someone from within the establishment that speaks truth to power in some way. It's not about mass resistance. It's kind of an elite, it's kind of limited to this sphere of elite politics, let's say journalists, intellectuals, public intellectuals. Historically, though, what I've found is that the meanings of this concept evolved in these different, I trace 7 different phases of late Ottoman and Republican Turkish history, from the kind of mid-19th century till 1965. And then, of course, the story continues today, but it's almost the whole book is in a way a prelude to current understandings, or a genealogy of the concept, if you will. Now, what I argue is that, broadly speaking, this concept also unlocks 3 key problems in the historiography of late Ottoman and modern Turkish history. And that is, first, it kind of allows us to unpack or parse out the relationships between liberalism and constitutionalism, that oftentimes claims were made about constitutionalism, and everybody claimed to be a liberal, and yet there was this illiberal undercurrent going on that then got played out in the Turkish national movement and in the Kemalist Republic. And so liberalism and constitutionalism are not always coterminous, or not always synonymous. And this muhalefet is kind of the opposition from within that forces us to kind of see the shades of gray there. That goes particularly for the mid-19th century until 1908. The second problematic that this muhalefet concept unlocks is the transition from the late Ottoman period to the Republican Turkish period. I feel like we're being Zoom bombed. I feel like something's not right here with one. There is obviously a claim of rupture that the Turkish Republic first asserts, and it becomes the dominant paradigm for decades. And then there is a claim by Eric Zurcher and others of continuity from the late Ottoman period through the CUP, the Committee for Union and Progress, into the Turkish Republic. What I'm arguing is that by looking at the history through the lens of muhalefet, we're actually able to transcend that binary between either rupture or continuity. And we can see the ways that both were true. And the fact that at the time, during the transition itself, this issue was already a key issue, the extent to which the power groups from the late Ottoman period, particularly the CUP, were being held over or were basically remaking themselves or recombining to form the Turkish national movement. And the very essence of opposition at that moment was to call out that continuity. So Eric Zurcher was perfectly right, and also not the first one to point out the continuity. It was being pointed out at the time. So Muhalefet also affords us a different kind of vista on the transition. And third, when we get to the Republican period, by looking at Muhalefet, the claims of Muhalefet and the kind of actions of these Muhalif figures, we also get to see the politics of history at work in the early Republic and the kind of the project to suppress memory of a lot of what was happening, basically suppress memory of the political in the immediate pre-Republican period, right? That national unity was sort of insisted upon through the process, and anyone who differed was not a Muhalif, but actually a traitor. So Muhalefet offers us this kind of, again, this midway category of someone who's sort of flirting with treason from the perspective of the national elites and the national project, but who isn't necessarily, like, we could argue about whether the Muhalifs at that moment who are opposing the national movement, let's say, are treasonous or not, or are they actually part of what could be accepted as legitimate opposition or disagreement within the national movement. So those are the three big rubrics, I guess, that Muhalefet can help us shift and see differently. Now, in terms of how the meanings of the term evolved, again, I'll try to give priority to the interwar period, but it doesn't make sense unless we think about what was going on just before that. What I argue is that, and this is the 7 chapters basically are divided along these lines, these 7 phases of Muhalefet, let's say, and begins with starting in the mid-19th century when the constitutional project was hatched, let's say, by the young Ottomans as liberals, kind of elite liberal bureaucrats, very much educated in French and maybe Anglophile proclivities, right? They started to formulate ideas about a hypothetical constitutional order. And then, of course, Mithat Pasha and others actually drafted the constitution that was enacted in 1876-77. And for them, Muhalefet was an important concept, and it was seen as a positive value in this hypothetical liberal constitutional order, that in order to have constitutionalism and democracy, you had to have dissent within. You had to have polyvocality, let's say. It wasn't just about one voice running the polity. So that, I would say, was at the crux from the beginning of liberal constitutionalism. Now, the CUP, the Committee for Union and Progress, comes into being after that the Constitution is suspended, and in the reaches of the Ottoman military and in spaces of exile. And that is where a proliferation of ideas about constitutionalism and how to restore the Constitution come to be, and lots of factions and disagreements. So there's a lot of that. They then ultimately formulate themselves as a broad coalition in favor of the Constitution as Muhalefet as a whole. So they see themselves as the opposition against Abdul Hamid II, who is the Sultan that has suspended the Constitution. So this is a different meaning for Muhalefet, right? They see themselves as these heroic opposition figures trying to rescue the Constitution. And ultimately they succeed in forcing Abdul Hamid to restore that Constitution in July 1908. So those are already 2 different meanings for Muhalefet. Once the Constitution is restored, the real interesting stuff begins, because all of these different ideas about what constitutionalism is and liberalism have to come out. The Pandora's box is opened, and all of these things have to be played out, and the actual Constitution has to be brought down to earth, and they have to work out what are the institutional boundaries and the separation of powers, and how are the non-Muslims going to fit in. All of these issues are coming out, and the CUP, who see themselves as the heroes of the story and the guardians of the Constitution, instrumentalize that document. And so there emerged two broad conceptions of what the constitution should be in the Ottoman polity. One is the constitution is the instrument for the CUP to maintain and increase their hold on power. And the other is this liberal conception that the Constitution, and it's kind of naive, I guess, because they didn't, clearly they didn't really win, that the Constitution should actually be the supreme law of the land and there should be institutions built, right? So these liberals kind of had a sort of naive trust that they could build these institutions. And of course, geopolitics was not going to let that happen because the Ottomans were surrounded by enemies that were waiting for a vulnerable moment to dive in and take away territory and attack, right? So this is so they didn't have many years to actually play out this experiment for constitutionalism. But in that context, muhalefet it takes on a different meaning. And instead of being the broad constitutional coalition, it now becomes the people opposed to the CUP. So now it gets associated with this broad kind of liberal camp there are journalists and writers in that camp, the people who object to the MO, to the modus operandi of the CUP, basically. And the CUP is itself changing at this time. I don't mean to say that it's a simple story, but the CUP is becoming, the power is becoming concentrated more and more in fewer and fewer hands as we go through this period from 1908 to 1912-13. So there is a key turning point for muhalefet, that it becomes synonymous with opposition to the CUP, which tells you the extent to which the CUP was assumed to have become the dominant power, the hegemonic power. It wasn't opposition to the Sultan anymore. The Sultan was beside the point. The CUP becomes power to the liberals' opposition, muhalefet. So then we get World War I, which is kind of, opposition, muhalefet goes into slumber because we're in a war regime, right? And we're in a kind of a state of emergency where the press is, it's only used for propaganda purposes. And, the opposition voices are just not able to do anything. So it picks up again in the armistice period at the close of 1918. And that again is the next huge turning point for muhalefet. A lot of different things happen in that period from 1918, 1919 to 1922, when the nationalists emerge victorious and force the scrapping of the Treaty of Sèvres, let's say, and force a new negotiation of terms for the peace. And then the Turkish Republic comes out the other side. Now, in that period, what we have is these liberal muhalifs who had opposed the CUP, a lot of them, some of them still oppose the national movement because they see that as the CUP in disguise. The CUP has officially disbanded. The British, everybody is against. It's almost like the de-Baathification problematic in Iraq after 2003. It's like they want them to go away, and yet they have penetrated so deeply in society and in halfway kind of creating a concept of Turkish nationalism that they can't fully be disbanded and evaporate into the air. So they recombine into a national, first resistance movement, then independence movement. And it's in this period, it's really fascinating because the muhalifs who had opposed the CUP still call themselves muhalifs. And even though they are the ones in government now, the Ottoman government is supposedly in power, although it's not. And the national movement really should be the muhalifs, right? They're the ones in opposition to power, but the name sticks. So the words are very sticky because the political dynamic is still there. So the muhalifs still see themselves as in opposition to the CUP, which is now the national movement. And the national movement calls these people muhalifs too. So they still see themselves as the CUP. So it's very revealing, the dynamics and the rhetoric that's happening in the press at this moment. So then we come out the other side into the Turkish Republic. And then there, again, shifting meanings of muhalefet, that there is a limited amount of opposition in the first 5 years of the Republic, and that the word is sort of used, muhalefet, but I wouldn't say it's it still has the same meanings. Then it kind of goes away altogether, like from 1928, when the Republic is fully consolidated, let's say, until 45. We're talking about a single party republic. So there isn't still a second party. And the word is, I would argue, and the title of that chapter is There is a World Underground, right? There is kind of this underground dissent, and it's within that one party, there are different wings that emerge, but it still doesn't actually play out in the open as two separate parties. And then the crescendo, the kind of grand finale is that from 1946, when they make a concession, Ismet Inonu makes a concession to allow a second party, it ushers in this multi-party period. And in that period, particularly from 1950, when the second party wins and comes into power, this notion of muhalefet and the history of muhalefet kind of comes back out into the open, and it again becomes a positive value in a post-war kind of Cold War atmosphere of the free world and sort of the lionization of democratic values and liberal freedoms, as opposed to the Soviet bloc and everything, right? So again, it changes its valence at these different stages of politics, of political evolution in Turkey. Now, how do I trace all of this? I tried to humanize this story, and I traced it all through the life and works of one muhalif, one opposition figure, Refik Halit Karay, who was not actually a politician. He did not lead an opposition party, and that is the whole point. There were very brief attempts to form opposition parties. He's not really involved in any of them. So it is a little odd, I guess, in that framework to choose him as the Sinektohi, I guess, for this story of muhalefet. But for other reasons, I argue that he's the perfect person for this. He is born in 1888 to a moderately privileged Istanbul family, and of bureaucrats, basically, in the public debt administration, the finance ministry. And his life, he dies in 1965, so it's not by coincidence that my choice to choose him. His life follows the chronology of muhalefet, and allows us to see all of those bigger changes through his experience. And he does have he is remarkably in sync with these broader shifts that are happening, which I cannot take credit for. So he was, at a few different points, he was a bureaucrat, but that was not really the main point of his career. He was a writer, he was a satirist, a journalist early on, a newspaper editor briefly. He basically was often on the outs with the CUP and then with the nationalists. And so he occupies this strange position of being certainly a Turk. He was Sunni Muslim, Turkish speaking, certainly part of the dominant elite of the late Ottoman period. And yet he, Erol Köroğlu at Boğaziçi calls him, in a short piece he wrote, calls him an anti-nationalist nationalist. So he is broadly part of what is becoming the national community, but I don't know, what does it mean to be an anti-nationalist nationalist? And I think it is telling us the extent to which the national movement was actually a partisan movement. So he is in that space where he's not in the single party of the CUP, which then becomes the one party of the Republic, but he is more broadly part of this larger Turkish community. And this helps explain why, even though he's on the outs at several different points, he ultimately gets brought back into the fold because he is part of that larger establishment. So he, born in Istanbul, he goes to Galatasaray high school for a while, drops out. He's, kind of a creative guy, doesn't want to sit still and be disciplined and go to law school. He comes of age just as the constitutional revolution happens in 1908. He's 20. So he starts writing in the press. He starts writing satire, very in keeping with what's going on around him. He's not unique in that sense. There's a huge proliferation of newspapers and satire and caricatures, very popular. So he's definitely part of that, and part of that larger fray of constitutionalists that are not avowed CUP unionists, right? That becomes more and more of a problem as the CUP becomes more and more dictatorial and authoritarian, so that by 1913, when they've taken over, they basically have had a coup d'etat and they've taken over the government, the state. He, along with 800 others, is exiled to Sinop on the Black Sea. And basically, this is all the intelligentsia, all the people who could pose a problem to CUP and be opposition in any way. They just ship them all off. So the good news is they don't kill them all, but they ship them all off and they remove them from the capital, so that there are really no opposition voices as the war begins the following year. Most of those people get let back to Istanbul when the war begins. He and only like 15 or 20 others, I guess he's that dangerous. I don't know. Or he's just that annoying. He has to stay in Anatolia in exile until early 1918. So he goes to a few other towns, Çorum and then Ankara and then Bilecik, and ends up back in Istanbul as the war is winding down, but has not yet ended. And then kind of the big drama is after the war comes to a close, he finds himself at this crucial moment, he finds himself as the director of the Post and Telegraph and Telephone Service for the Ottoman government under British occupation. And this is the precise moment when Mustafa Kemal, this is the beginning of the Turkish national drama, right? This is the precise moment when Mustafa Kemal lands in Samsun, starts to mobilize the different localized national resistance forces, and proclaims his movement in June of 1919. How can he proclaim it? He needs the telegraph. He needs to communicate that message across Anatolia and to the Ottoman government. And Refik Halit is sitting in Istanbul in charge of the telegraph service. So there is actually a one-on-one confrontation that happens. And that I think is that moment when constitutionalism hits up against self-determination. Right. So like the whole kind of premise of the Turkish national movement is to fulfill the promise of the Wilsonian 14 points, particularly is it point 11? That's about, is it 11? That's for Turkish sovereignty or some form of Ottoman sovereignty. And there's Refik Halit working for the British, a colonial, collaborator, let's say, but in his eyes, loyal to the Ottomans and just, doing what he's supposed to do and defending the Sultanate against these mavericks and these rebels and upstarts. And so there is this kind of, it's a confrontation between two historical epics, maybe encapsulated in these two figures. So he opposes the nationalists, and he continues to oppose them and to do whatever he can through the summer of 1919 to foil their attempts to spread information. They go on and have the Sivas Congress in September of 1919, which is kind of the constitutional convention, I guess, of the Turkish national movement. And he steps down, the cabinet that he's part of steps down at the end of that. And it's through this armistice period that we see this fascinating pattern in his writings that he actually, so he writes a proliferation of stories and essays viscerally opposed to the national movement, right? Because they're the continuation of the CUP. And he actually goes as far, I argue, as to start to create kind of an archetype of a muhalif. He starts to then create a historical narrative for muhalefet, which hasn't been done before. And this is where I would argue he is the perfect person to use for this study, because he is the one who actually makes the most rhetorical use of this concept. He's using this concept all the time. Other people might actually be opposition figures, but they're not talking about it all the time like he is. So we have this amazing sort of insight through his eyes of what this period looked like and the tragic figure of the muhalif, basically. So even he sees at that moment that even though the CUP is evil and the nationalists are the CUP, these muhalifs are somehow righteous, but also just totally emasculated and just impotent, like unable to actually go against in any effective way and create anything else. So he's not stupid. He's not sitting around talking about these ideologies that should be, he doesn't have a map to get to someplace else. It's kind of it's opposition kind of just for its existential sake, right? So it's a fascinating moment that gets buried after the fact. And those stories actually that I talk about in the chapter on this get excised from the record in the Republican period. So it kind of shows that it is a touchy spot in Republican Turkey to look back on that moment when there was this space of opposition, even if it was doomed. So he then chooses exile. There's his immediate associate and superior was Ali Kemal, who gets arrested and ultimately lynched when the nationalists come to power in late 1922. So he sees the writing on the wall and escapes the country. So he chooses exile and goes to French Mandate, Syria, Lebanon, which is an interesting choice. And after he goes, the list of 150 is created and enshrined in the Treaty of Lausanne, actually, and he's on that list. And this is a list of 150 persona non grata in the new state of Turkey. So they don't get Turkish citizenship and they're banished. So his choice is validated, I suppose. His choice of exile is validated by the new Republican regime. So he spends the interwar period, it might be interesting to talk about it like this too. He spends this whole interwar period from late 1922 until 1938, summer 1938, in Beirut, Aleppo, a little bit Alexandretta, Sanjak, and he gets sort of involved in the politics there in that contentious territory in the interwar period. And then he returns in 1938 to Istanbul when it's, and then World War II. It's interesting because in Turkey, it's interesting to think about the extent to which the term interwar even makes sense, because Turkey was neutral in World War II. And so it was a very different experience for Turkey than it was for all of Europe pretty much, and so many other places. So that in some sense, Ataturk dies. Maybe had World War II not happened, it would have maybe become a two-party state at that point, a two-party system, but the war just suspends everything for 7 years or whatnot, 5 years. We come out the other side, and he gets let back to Istanbul basically on the agreement that he's not going to make any trouble anymore. So he's a very different kind of figure when he gets back. He consciously reworks his past. He takes his, because again, nobody can read them because they were written in Ottoman Turkish. So when he gets back, the alphabet reform has happened in the interim. So in order for him to have any measure of fame or notoriety, he's got to republish an anthology of his works to reintroduce himself to the Turkish public. So he does that almost immediately upon arrival. There are 39, 40, we find a series of his publications being released in Latin characters, in modern Turkish. And, with selective changes, editorial changes to fit the new exigencies of Republican Turkish politics. So that is very revealing. And I track some of the changes. And then he becomes a hero basically in the 50s of the Democrat Party, of the Second Party. And, we can talk more, but that takes us out of the interwar period. Perhaps I shouldn't talk too much about that. The last thing I'll just touch on, well, obviously the literary piece, the literary level of this is prominent in the book, and I haven't talked so much about it, but we're talking about politics and isms. So unless we want to talk about modernism in literature, it's not quite as relevant. But the other thing I just wanted to point out is what I do try to do is, and I think this is quite new, is to thread through this theme of memory and suppression of memory around the Armenian genocide. Because most mainstream histories of Turkey don't touch on it. There is a whole field of scholarship about the Armenian genocide, but specifically about that. And so I think this is the first time that someone has tried to kind of integrate the two and sort of tell a story of the emergence of modern Turkey and take account for the fact that these series of events in 15 and 16 were actually formative for the modern Turkish Republic and for the way it talked about itself, the stories it tells about itself and doesn't tell. And this muhalif perspective throws that off. It throws a wrench in it just ever so much, because guess what? He was witness to one of the events associated with the genocide, which was the fire in Ankara in 1916 when he was in exile. He did not, as far as I know, he did not write about it at the time. He did write about it in August of 1921 when the nationalist movement was in full throttle, and he wanted to expose the nationalists for being the continuation of the CUP. Then he writes this incredibly powerful essay, eyewitness account of that fire. And I provide a full verbatim translation of that because I just think it's such a kind of mind-blowing source from that moment. And he's evoking the memory of that event because of the partisan battle that's going on at that moment, not necessarily because for the sake of exposing that event, right? Then he goes into exile, he comes back, he reworks that essay into a much bigger essay that's more like an essay of praise about Ankara, the new capital of the Turkish Republic. So he puts it into a totally different context. The kernel, the nucleus of that account is still in there, but he has made very deliberate revisions and redactions to that text. And so I trace very closely what he has done. So through tracing the event and the memory and the texts of that, I'm making a larger argument also about the importance of the Armenian genocide to the formulation of Turkish politics and to the suppression, the kind of, I guess, the consensus among the new Republican elite to just suppress memory of that, right? And he kind of gets in the way of it at a few different points and then ultimately accepts it. He's not then going to call out, and by the 50s, he's pretty happy as a nationalist and kind of a chauvinist because the nation state has been kind of consolidated. It's not under question at this point. It's, I guess, secure enough that they can allow this second party. We can talk about where that goes, though. It goes to a cycle of coup d'etat after that. But I do think that his story in its kind of unfinishedness and the unfinishedness of his ideas and his kind of counter narrative of history is pretty crucial to understanding the conflicted stance about opposition and multivocality in modern Turkey. And that is why I end with this little anecdote about him saying in a letter to Riza Tevfik that one day he's going to, when all the emotions have subsided, one day he's going to sit down and write a dispassionate monograph about this whole story. And he, as far as I know, he's never written it. And so it is, I think that's what I'm trying to say with that last anecdote, that the sort of critical history of Turkey is an unwritten, it's still as yet unwritten. And we need this voice. We need these kinds of voices incorporated in if we're going to really arrive at a complete and critical history of that polity. So I will leave it at that and hand it over to Dimitri.
Right. Thank you, Christine. You always change my game plan. I had different notes now, but anyway, I'll stick to my notes because we will be talking forever regarding the book.
Okay.
So I'm not this time. I'm not going to fall into that trap. So first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, specifically my friend Hakon Ikonomou, for the kind invitation. I have to say that I'm rather biased in a positive way towards that book, not only because Christine is a friend, but also because, more importantly, I think because the book is thought-provoking in so many different ways. I think Christine elaborated on some of that aspects. One of the first things I had said to Christine when I read the book is that it was as if I was reading the material related to the period I've seen, because I've seen the same period in the Ottoman Empire and the early Republican era in Turkey, but I've seen it through the Greek Orthodox minority of Istanbul, whereas this time around is as if I was seeing it from the eyes of a prominent member of the Turkish Muhalefet, the Turkish opposition, Muhalif. And I have to agree with the point that Benjamin Fortna is making about the book, that the fact that that Christine has brought on the analytical surface the term of Muhalefet and Muhalif changes the way we look at the field, and especially changes the way we look at that transition from the late Ottoman Empire to the emergence and consolidation of the Republic of Turkey after 1923. And what I will try to do today is see the story of Refik Khalid, and I'm happy that Christine mentioned most of the points, so I don't have to mention them. So what I will do is try to link it with the story of the Constantinopolitan Greeks during the same period and see them in comparison. Because as I said, like it's like seeing the same period, and it's like a coin having two sides. It's the side of the Constantinopolitan Greeks, and it's also the side of someone of the Ottoman establishment who actually is really active during that period. In an unusual manner, I will start from the afterword of the book and not from the beginning, because at some point, Christine, in the afterword of the book, she dedicates like 4 or 5 lines in the end about the Greek Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox minority. And she says that, you know, it's more or less that the until some point, Refik Khalid had to suffer the same fate like the Greek Orthodox minority, with the difference being that Refik Khalid was eventually allowed to return to Turkey in 1938, whereas the Constantinopolitan Greeks, especially the ones who had supported the Greek redentist policy of the Megali Idea, of the great idea during the armistice period, were never allowed to return, although they had every right to, according to the Treaty of Lausanne. And I will just try to elaborate on these 3 or 4 lines of Christine and show how that same fate developed from 1908 and throughout the interwar period, let's say. So Christine starts with 1908, and she basically describes the division of the Young Turks between 2 broad factions, the centralists, mostly represented by the Committee of Union and Progress, and the Federalists, which was, we would say, that they were mainly represented by the liberals of Prince Abahedin. But what is interesting is that big division, let's say, among the Ottoman, within the Young Turks and in the Ottoman establishment, there was also a similar division within the non-Muslim communities of the empire. So we have a division within the Greek Orthodox community between the nationals, the ethniki, who in a sense are the same like the liberals, and they try to collaborate politically with the liberals, and the anti-nationals, the adethniki, the majority of whom become members of the Committee of Union and Progress and are elected as deputies in the Ottoman Parliament with the Committee of Union and Progress. And we see that this radicalization that Christine describes in such an eloquent manner, it's not only an intra-communal or intra-political radicalization, but it's also intercommunal. So what happens between communities happens also within communities, both Muslim and non-Muslim. And I'm sure that I remember, like, for example, Aris Sekerian's work, he has also described what happens also in the Armenian millet. Something similar happens with the Armenians. So therefore, we see that within this concept of Ottomanism, there is an intercommunal power struggle and political struggle. And Christine describes how that political struggle plays in the field of parliamentary debates and press, where Rafik Khalid is very active, especially with his writings, which results in him being exiled for the first time in Sinop, where you have a lot of exiled journalists and intellectuals and so on. But what's very interesting to someone who has seen that from, let's say, the Greek point of view, is that the same thing happens with the Greek Orthodox journalists and publishers and intellectuals. So we have two very well-known cases: Konstantinos Panoudis, the publisher of Prodos, and Voutiras, the publisher of Neologos, who at the same time are also exiled and they go to Athens. So in a sense, we see that the Committee of Union and Progress, in its effort to retain the power in the Ottoman Empire, deals in the same way both with the Mukhalif and the non-Muslims who are in opposition. Therefore, everyone is treated as an enemy of the state. And I think this is very interesting, because usually when we deal with the history of non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, we present them as the only victims of power abuse, whereas we see in this case, it's not an issue of being a Muslim or non-Muslim, but it's more an issue of being a member of the Committee of Union and Progress or not. And then Christine refers to me a very interesting story that Rafik Khalid wrote, The Joke, which in a sense shows his comment, but silent comment, on the Armenian on the persecutions against the Armenians, which take place actually geographically where he's located. And he says something along the lines of silent complicity. So in a sense, there is the sense of being a Mukhalif, there is a sense of opposing the power of the CQP, but still there is a limit to that. And that limit, that border, is the Armenian genocide. This is a border that Rafik Khalid is not willing to cross. Well, it's funny because this is also what happens with the that there are like parallel paths there. Once the Balkan Wars break out, and after the Balkan Wars break out, so there is this massive influx of Muslim refugees from the Balkans coming to, especially from Macedonia and Thrace, coming to the Ottoman Empire. There is this hatred towards the non-Muslims, and there is this suspicion from the Committee of Union and Progress. I think this is the let's say the breakup of the cohesion of the Ottoman society. And this is the time where the nationals, the Greek nationals, who were the leadership of the Orthodox Greeks, go underground. Patriarch Joachim III dies, and therefore the people who collaborated with the Committee of Union and Progress become the leadership of the community. And we see that Patriarch Hermanos, contrary to what the Armenian Patriarch is doing, he remains silent. He remains silent, and he balances between this involuntary collaboration with the Committee of Union and Progress, but also which comes out of necessity, let's say. But at the same time, it is also a means to consolidate the power of the Adethniki, of the Greek anti-nationals in the Orthodox millet. And therefore, by keeping this cautious stance towards the Committee of Union and Progress, no matter how passive or contradictory it might seem, there could be an argument saying that he remains silent out of fear that the Orthodox Greeks could have the same tragic fate that the Armenians had during World War I in the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, we see that both the Mukhalif and the Mukhalifs and the Constantinopolitan Greeks who represent the Orthodox millet stop right before really getting involved with the Armenian genocide or commenting about it. And for the Mukhalifs and for Rafik Khalid is a way of surviving politically, let's say, but for the Constantinopolitan Greeks and for the Greek Orthodox of the Empire is a way of surviving, period. Now, it also shows, this comparison shows also the absolute dominance of the Committee of Union and Progress over the political life and liberties in the Ottoman Empire during this period, which I think Christine describes in a way both of an analysis of the period, but also through the writings of Refik Khalid, where you realize that the Mukhalifs have been put in the corner, so to speak. There's no way out under the pressure of the Committee of Union and Progress. So the war ends, we come to the armistice period. And I like the fact that Christine uses the term, it's a counter narrative of the struggle of the Turkish nationalist movement, whereas usually we read histories about what happened in Ankara, but she shifts the focus to Istanbul, which is something that I did also. So this is maybe something that I really enjoyed, instead of reading all the time about what Athens did or what happened in Smyrna. And she describes a power struggle between Istanbul and Ankara, where Istanbul is still the seat of the official government, whereas in Ankara we have the nationalist government of Mustafa Kemal. Well, interestingly, there is the same kind of power struggle between Istanbul and Athens. So in Istanbul, you have the supporters of Venizelos, who support the Greek redemptionist plan of the Megali Idea, which the main idea was liberating the Greeks under the Ottoman rule and uniting with the Kingdom of Greece. And especially after the loss of Venizelos in the elections of 1920, there is this power struggle between Venizelist Constantinople and the royalist, the pro-royalist Athens. So in a sense, we see two parallel power struggles where Istanbul, whether it's the seat of the Ottoman government or whether it's the second national center for the Greeks, are opposed to Ankara on the one hand and Athens on the other. And through the telegraph incident, which I find also very revealing of the way that certain factions within the Ottoman establishment try to oppose the nationalist movement in Turkey. One of the main arguments that Refik Khalid is using is that the Turkish national movement is more or less the Committee of Union and Progress in disguise. So it's again the Committee of Union and Progress, but with a different name. Well, that's the exact same argument that the non-Muslims, especially the Greeks and the Armenians, are using in order to claim either unification with Greece or an autonomous state. They're saying that we cannot trust the Turkish nationalists and the Turkish nationalist movement and Kemal Atatürk, because basically all are continuing with the policy of the Committee of Union and Progress. So therefore, we see that both the Mukhalifs and the non-Muslims of the empire are using the same argument, that we cannot stand again an oppressive regime like the one of the Committee of Union and Progress under now Mustafa Kemal. And I think that for anyone who will read this the book, it's interesting to read that article that Refik Khalid wrote in Sabah, where, in a sense, if someone puts it next to what was published in Greek newspapers in Constantinople at the time, they say exactly the same things. It's very interesting. I mean, if you take the names away, you think that you are probably reading non-Muslim Constantinopolitan press of the period. And the problem with Refik Khalid and the Mukhalifs is something that now they have Greece as their protector. So the Mukhalifs eventually are being accused of being traitors and sell out to the British who occupied Constantinople. and most of them eventually leave Istanbul, they abandon Istanbul, they fled Istanbul. Refik Khalid is one of these prominent Mukhalifs that actually left due to the fact that they were so active against the Turkish nationalist movement during the armistice period. They also see what has happened with other individuals belonging to the group. For example, Ali Kemal has been lynched. So therefore, they're afraid for a worse fate. There are calls for Refik Khalid to be executed as a traitor. But exactly the same thing happens with the leadership of the Constantinopolitan Greeks. All of them fled Istanbul before the entrance of the Turkish Nationalist Army in Istanbul, and they were lists made by the authorities and of the Kemalist movement for specific members of the Constantinopolitan Greek leadership to be arrested and executed. So therefore, we see that the Mukhalifs and the Constantinopolitan Greeks share the same fate. I mean, they both are considered as traitors, and they both have to abandon Istanbul due to the fact that they expect the worst once the city is surrendered to the Turkish nationalist forces. Now, the interesting part is that after 1922, neither of the two groups, nor the Mukhalifs, the list of 150 Mukhalifs, nor the Constantinopolitan Greeks are allowed to return. This is the case of the absent Constantinopolitan Greeks, as we call them, who had every right to return according to the Lausanne Treaty, but they were not allowed to return due to the fact that they were considered traitors. And we see that again, it's the same policy, regardless of being Muslim or non-Muslim. It's an issue of being a nationalist or a non-nationalist. What's interesting in the writings of Refik Khalid and in comparing to the writings of the Constantinopolitan Greeks who come to Greece is that nostalgia for Istanbul. So at some point, I think Refik Khalid, if I remember correctly, he writes that I do not miss anything from Turkey apart from Istanbul. And he brings that, you know, he has this kind of idealized vision of Istanbul being a paradise on earth, which is basically exactly the same kind of writings we read from the Constantinopolitan Greeks, that what we miss is Istanbul and we want to come back and so on. So in a sense, these Mukhalifs, I would say, form a displaced community. I mean, it's a term that I never thought that I would use for people belonging to the Ottoman higher echelons of the Ottoman establishment, but it's true. It's until 1938, at least, they're a displaced community. And I would say also they're a community in exile, which is a term I've been using for the Constantinopolitan Greeks, but I guess for these Mukhalifs, it fits well. And what is sad and sad, I don't know, it's the funny things that happen with history is that both of these groups are taking a gamble. He says that, Refik Khalid says that, because at some point he asks someone, he says, and if you lose, what if the nationalists lose? Well, at the end of the day, they didn't. So, you know, Refik Khalid played all of his, you know, he placed a bet on the liberals and on the British occupying the city, but this is not how things turned out. And it's the same with Constantinopolitan Greeks. They gambled on Greece winning the Greek-Turkish War of 1922, of, you know, becoming eventually a part of Greater Greece, but none of these visions actually happened in the end. And something that is really interesting for the interwar period is that Refik Khalid realizes, while in exile, he realized that the reforms being introduced by Mustafa Kemal and during the Republican era are not new at all. They're actually measures and policies of the Committee of Union and Progress reintroduced by Mustafa Kemal. And he sees these continuities. He sees these continuities both with regards to centralist policies, financial policies, the Turkification of the economy, language issues, and so on. But he also realizes these reforms with regards to the non-Muslims. And he realizes that the only way to return to Istanbul is to completely sanitize his past, to completely whitewash whatever could be considered as provocative or against Kemal or against the new regime, and in a sense be a loyal Kemalist and a loyal Turkish citizen. And this is exactly what the Constantinopolitan Greeks are doing, and the Armenians are also doing after 1923. The ones who remain in Istanbul, the only way for them to be able to exist in Istanbul is be loyal Turkish citizens, follow the laws of the country, even in the cases where these laws violate their minority rights. And this allows them some kind of privacy and some kind of their own identity within their own privacy, within the limits and the borders of the community. So therefore, in public, they have to be Turkish loyal citizens and not create any problems. And this way, they have some sort of communal liberty and identity, special identity, let's say their own identity, unique identity, and they're allowed to express it within the community. Now, to come full circle with regards to what Christine says in the afterword, I think that it's interesting because someone could do a double argument. The one argument is that the Mukhalifs, until at least 1938, are treated the same as the non-Muslims, and especially the ethnocentric circles of the non-Muslims. So they're treated as traitors of the homeland, and there's no in a sense, differentiation in the way they're treated. But at the same time, somebody could also claim that we could also see if we see it from the other side, we could also see the non-Muslims, and especially the ones, the ethnocentric circles of the non-Muslims, whether they were the Greek Orthodox or Armenians, as Mukhalifs. So, you know, both arguments could be made, because in the end of the day, I think that in a sense, somebody could extend the category of Mukhalifs and Mukhalefet also to the non-Muslims especially of the period from 1908 onwards, where you have, you know, after you have one Ottoman parliament, the Ottomanism is still considered to be the main policy of the state. So therefore, it could be, there could be included, hypothetically speaking and in analytical terms, within the barriers of being a Mukhalif and Mukhalefet. And I think that this is what I think that this is what I find very interesting, is the fact that it gives us also another analytical category. I think this is what Christine, at least the way I see it, this is what Christine brought, and it's really innovative. It brings us an analytical category that we had not seen before, at least with regards to the non-Muslims of the empire. So I think these are my main points, and I have I don't know if it's a question/comment. I will put it as a question, but I think you can comment on it. Is this a political book? I think it's a political book. Like, if you really think about it, I think, at least the way I see it and the way things have been developing and evolving in Turkey, I think somebody could really think that it's also it's also a political book. But I think this is up to you to clarify. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dimitris. Christina, there was a lot of food for thought there. I am sure you have some thoughts and remarks.
I do. I really appreciate those comments. And it's funny that I guess the British are the missing piece here, because the British were so, actively involved trying to run things that, and the British also had the same problem that the non-Muslims and the Muhalifs had. And it's interesting that the Muhalifs and Rafiq Khalid, through a different prism, we could call him a reactionary. That's what he was kind of considered by the nationalists. The non-Muslims are considered parasites, right? And obstacles to national self-realization, self-determination, right? That need to be eliminated. And of course, the British are the imperialists, and the two aforementioned groups are collaborating with the British. So they're all in the same larger negative category from the nationalist perspective. And I just think it's interesting. What Dimitri started to do is sort of, turn everything on itself and look at the two sides of the coin. And I was thinking, well, okay, so Rafiq Khalid is a reactionary liberal. And isn't that interesting? He's kind of the mirror image or the flip side of the nationalists, who are effectively illiberal constitutionalists. Like, they want a constitution, but they want to use it for illiberal purposes, right? And maybe that is the point of interwar, that maybe that's where they're very much an interwar polity, right? This kind of interesting fusion of like constitutionalism and authoritarianism making fascism, right? Like, so yeah, that's what I'm thinking. And I'm also trying to map, as Dimitri was talking, I was also trying to map on the fact that this case, these liberals, these muhalifs, whatever, are always kind of silenced in the dominant history of Turkey, as the non-Muslim experience is also silenced and suppressed. And I was trying to think, well, okay, so these guys are basically like, let's look at the broader Middle East. Let's look at the Arab Middle East. Who would their counterparts be, right? And I guess, in the case of Egypt, would it be the Khedival family, and then all of the kind of elite around them that were constantly in cahoots with the British and continued to kind of maintain a hold on power until Nasser, right? Until the 50s. And we all know how Egypt turned out. Like, it was that, I don't know. So if Rafiq Khalid and his ilk, or the Hashemites, I don't know, like these groups that were elite and then collaborated with the British to create these kind of not quite nation states, but something supposedly leading to that, right? That the British were going to have, is that had the nationalists not come along and Rafiq Khalid and his ilk had their day, would that have just, I think you could only argue it would have been a disaster. I don't know. It would have eventually led to something. I don't know. I have unfinished thoughts on this, but it kind of forced me to, thinking about bringing the non-Muslims in kind of forced me to step back and think about it in the larger regional context as well. And what all of these isms meant and how unique Turkey was in Mustafa. It really was kind of a miracle that like this kind of group formed and came to power and had a military and then a political diplomatic victory so quickly, when we know what happened in Syria with the kingdom, the Battle of Mosul, and these like attempts, these kind of pitiful attempts to shake off the European yoke. And so through the perspective that we've started to carve out, the nationalists look pretty bad. And and they do, like, if you're a non-Muslim, they look pretty bad. And if you're a liberal, they look pretty bad. But I guess we also have to come full circle. And again, in order to arrive at like a comprehensive understanding of all of this, we also have to see kind of how remarkable that move was at that moment in time. So, and it is an outlier in the interwar, is it not? It's really quite an outlier for the interwar world, I think. So those are that's my stream of consciousness reaction to Dimitri's great comments.
Thank you very much, Christine. I think, or you had a question or comment? Do unmute. Yeah.
Two. Yeah, sorry, I have two questions. One question, one comment question for Christine. Thank you very much for your research, and I read your book and your first book, and it was very, very interesting. And I read the first article of this book in the comparative studies because I write my dissertation about post-Ottoman Egypt, and they use in your book.
Great.
Yeah, but my first question, it's actually okay. You present the story of Rafik Khalid Karai, but it's actually the story if we use in Karl Mannheim term, it's a historical generation. It's, for example, like Mehmet Akif or Mustafa Sabri, or like you mentioned Fortna as a Shref Bey, and in Egypt we have people, and we have in all the North Africa and the Michael Provan. So maybe we have here, it's not a unique story. It's a historical generation of people who was born in the late Ottoman period or in late imperial world. It's also in Austro-Hungary or also in Russian. It's yeah. And my second question, it's more a technical question. Why are you using the interwar and not in post-Ottoman? Actually, it's a post-Ottoman. Karai moved to Haleb. Haleb, it was Ottoman territory until 1918. So why it's interwar and not post-Ottoman? We know today, all the maybe the Ottoman Empire collapsed as a political system, but as a cultural, social, and intellectual culture, it continued until the 40s in Egypt, for example.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Those are great questions. And on the second question first, I do use post-Ottoman. I'm using interwar because of the context for this series that Haakon has done. So it's, like I said, it is a bit, it throws things off a little bit to think of it as interwar, but I would definitely think of it as post-Ottoman. And certainly that's what, a lot of colleagues of mine who do the Arab modern Middle East, for instance, they are really angry with Karai. They're angry with Rafik Khalid because here he was in Mandate Syria, not a peep about the Arab rebellions, about Arab nationalism, about anti-colonialism. No, he was okay with colonialism, right? Because guess what? As an Ottoman, he identified more with the French than he did with the Arab masses. He was an elitist, and he was, an advocate of empire. He wanted to find a way for the empire to continue, maybe even in a British-like system where you'd retain the monarchy and have some kind of, parliamentary system developing underneath it, which was what was sort of starting to happen before the nationalists.
Of course, but if also he has a book I found in Istanbul, his book, and you also using this in your book, Surgun. It's exiled, so it's very interesting to think if it's exiled from the Ottoman Empire or from the homeland. Actually, the Ottoman Empire. So this is the reason I ask you why you don't using post-Ottoman. Maybe for him, it was the Ottoman Empire. It was the homeland.
Well, that's what's so fascinating about that novel. And in fact, I wrote a piece about that novel more extensively, and it didn't make it into the book, but I should probably publish it separately because it's just amazing. He arrives, the thinly veiled Rafik Khalid arrives in Beirut, and it's late 22. So it's a couple years since it's been, it was part of his imperium, and suddenly it's a foreign land and he doesn't know Arabic. And he gets to the customs office, and it's an Armenian who's working there. And so it's like all of the same assemblage of characters from his homeland, and yet the power structure has been rearranged. And so there's a foreignness and this strange sense of loss. It's a fascinating dynamic at that moment. And he has these descriptions of the Armenian quarter in Beirut, which is still there, Burj Hamud, right? And and it's amazing because this is like 7 years after the genocide, right? And it's just this very sensory, just such a very visceral description of what it felt like to watch, the smells and the sights that you'd see and everything. And it is so evocative. And it is very post-Ottoman. I mean, it's still the wreckage of what has just happened. It's not something new. It's not, modern Middle East or whatever. He's seeing it through an Ottoman lens for sure. And he's seeking out Turkish speakers who end up being Armenians. Those are the Turkish speakers you can find in Aleppo in the 20s. So he's hanging out with these Armenians. So no, it's fascinating. You're totally right. And the first question was, the historical generation. Absolutely. And I think that that's the whole thing. I think that in the Ottoman case, the complexities of experience of that generation have been so thoroughly buried by Nutuk, by the nationalist hegemonic narrative, that we can't, with the Austrian case, there's writings, there's novels, there's still these voices that were just kind of lingering there that nobody tried to completely silence. In the Soviet case, it's a little different because the ideological apparatus was so much more elaborate that those people would be czarists and bourgeois. There are so many reasons to marginalize them. But again, I don't think they were completely silenced. They were marginalized, but the works, the literary works, the kind of articulations still stood there, even in exile, let's say. But in the Ottoman case, there's just like, of course, Ersoy, we know about them. We know they went into exile. They came back eventually, maybe not. But like the actual vantage points of these people, of this generation. And that is one of the first things that drew me into this project, was like, how can we not know anything about the actual like intellectual and emotional experience of that transition? Like these people, these are the same people before, during, and after. Why are they not telling us how this feels and what this looks like and what's changing and what's not? And he really did do that. And then in the 40s, he did, I think it became more fashionable in the 40s to do this, but he also really delved in, and he did this book that I think I refer to in passing in my book, called 3 Generations, 3 Lives. And it's pretty systematic about all different aspects of life and how it changes. Although his present is post-1908, which is also very telling about the assumed continuity of the armistice period and from Ottoman to Republic. But so he's really trying to process how life has changed in his lifetime, and how it's really 3 different worlds. And so I found it that should be, those kinds of things should have been the dominant understanding, but because of politics and because of the need to put national unity above everything else, this generation really gets buried. So that's a great question too. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I should clarify that the series is about Biographies of Interwar Isms, is precisely about this, is about kind of exploring and quite literally exploding the categories of interwar and isms, conceptually, geographically, and chronologically. So this is why I think it's so interesting with Refik Khalid, how he's on both sides of the so-called interwar, and there is a kind of a transformation of his way of being oppositional on each side in a way. So just to say that that's not a label that Christina has put out there, but rather something I've provocatively put into this context. I think I will hand it over to Laura, and then I'll take a last question if there's time. So please, Laura.
Okay, so I'll do my best not to steal your time then, Håkon. Thanks, Christine, very much for a very fascinating expose with a few, for me, particularly thought-provoking elements. And I'll just mention one, and it really feeds on to, or it continues on from your response to Or's question as well. So I was really particularly struck by this labeling of your main protagonist as an anti-nationalist nationalist. And then in connection to that, the Mannheimian historical generation concept that Or then also introduces, I think really that speaks to one another very much. And in a way, it also made me think very early on in your talk about my own research, which might be a very unlikely kind of comparison, but which really deals with Jewish politics, both in the same period, but also later on. really thinking of Zionism and the inner diversity that actually existed, particularly in this period, and particularly amongst those early communities that were already in Palestine. So in a sense, in the same geographical sphere, but with very different backgrounds, and the context was very different, of course. But still, this kind of inner diversity of a national project that I think you expose, there are very much parallels there as well. And there's even parallels, I think, with the way history then is being written later on, where it becomes this kind of monodirectional narrative, where there's no space for this heterodox reality at the time. And then it takes maybe decades, and maybe until the 21st century, until these more diverse narratives can be uncovered. So I think that's really great. But bringing in that maybe seemingly unlikely comparison with Zionists and kind of anti-statist Zionist groups, self-professed Zionist groups within Palestine, which existed, really the kind of binationalists of the 1920s and 30s that then become really pacifist, anti-establishment, anti-statist groups in the post-war and especially post-48 period. And that makes me wonder if this idea of a historical generation, if we shouldn't explode that as well. So I think the comparison made with the Habsburg co-generationists, and maybe the Russian one as well, maybe we should leave kind of, or add on to that imperial framework and think of this generation as maybe this particular moment in time, like where is nationalism as such, as a concept? How does it manifest itself in different ways in the 1920s and 1930s? And are there maybe similarities if we use a global scope, especially through these individuals, where there's maybe something specific about this period that is not particularly Turkish or Ottoman, that is not particularly imperial, but that there's something else that combines these oppositional figures within the mainstream of the national movements that are so dominant in different periods. So this is just more like the kind of reflections that I went through listening to. And I'm just wondering if that resonates with you, or you have any thoughts about this kind of rethinking of what maybe is cross-imperial or cross transnationally the same. Is there something specific about this period? We can call it interwar or post-Ottoman, but maybe interwar in that sense makes more sense. That is maybe specific about nationalism at this particular moment in time. Any thoughts? Thank you.
Yeah, again, these are going to be very half formulated, but a lot of thoughts. I guess what I would say, again, basing on, okay, first, definitely what I was trying to do is bring out the diversity underneath supposed national unity. And in a sense, that's what I tried to do in my first book too, that like in a very different way, that there were these Greek Orthodox Christians who, had assumed certain positions of power and had a certain understanding of politics and society. It wasn't ultimately the national understanding, and they remained in the Ottoman Imperium and continued to participate in this other understanding of politics that intersected in various. So it's a way of unpacking the Greek experience, which in its own, in the Greek case, nobody tries to hide the partisanship. Let's put it that way. Everybody understands there were multiple voices, and yet they were all part of some kind of assumed consensus about what it meant, like what Hellenism meant, let's say, in the modern world, right? There's some oversimplification. And so this is a way of kind of disturbing that or disrupting that consensus, I guess, and bringing to light the Phanariates. In the same way, I was trying to disturb, which is a much more top-down consensus in Turkey, I think, that has been quite effective until the past 20 or 30 years, that, there weren't really alternative voices at the time, or there were, but they were treasonous. They were bad collaborators, whatever. So there was a judgment. There was a real shaming, I guess, of dissent and multivocality. Now, what did I want to say? You were saying, I'm trying to sort of back up and think about what the more generic problem is in the late 19th into this interwar period. And I think it is like, there was a weird way, at least in the Ottoman case, where for much of the 19th century, empire and nation coexisted in a weird tension, and it obviously became untenable at a certain point. And I feel like the interwar period is, again, there are these breaks, but people still haven't quite worked out, I guess, kind of this thing about constitutionalism versus self-determination, right? Because national self-determination doesn't guarantee democracy, does it? I don't know, right? It doesn't necessarily guarantee that. I mean, maybe Hako, I don't know, you guys maybe know better, but I feel like there are, well, and of course, colonialism continues apace in the interwar period. So I feel like these isms are, it's not that we've just left the imperial or the colonial age and entered the national age. They are all still kind of coexisting, and people are trying to work out what the relation, like what the principle of politics should be, really. I mean, in the Ottoman case, that's the problem, is that and Dominic Levin said this very well, that like in the 19th century, in order to be taken seriously, you had to be an expansionist empire. And you had to then also become a nation state in order to have legitimacy. So there are these two opposing principles for legitimacy happening. And Zionism, interestingly, is kind of an outgrowth of both. I was teaching it the other day. I'm a relative novice to that whole story, but like it was occurring to me that it is kind of a byproduct of both of these maybe conflicting tendencies in the late 19th and early 20th century, right? So that it's still, I guess maybe that accounts for the diversity of voices, is that it's not a foregone conclusion how these isms should relate to each other and what the constituent makeup of the state should be, right? Or of any political project. So I don't know, to the extent that is a coherent answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura and Christine. I want to perhaps add yet another comparison. I'm writing about Thanasis Agnidis' ongoing work. And one of the things that are quite striking to me in this kind of negotiation of where to place oneself is, and I've thought about this concept, anti-nationalist, nationalist. And for me, he's a kind of an anti-nationalist patriot in a way. He doesn't want to fall into the politics of domestic infighting, but he wants to contribute to the place of Greece in the post-war order, as modern, as accepted, and as a state. And this is kind of his kind of patriotism from the outside. What is because he works in the League of Nations, so he has this kind of distance to it as well, which sometimes really he's confronted with the reality on the ground, right? Particularly when he visits Greece very much as an outsider coming from Cappadocia via Istanbul to Paris and then back to Greece. But one of the things that is quite striking, and I think perhaps also links to the prism of the biography or the personal prism to broader tendencies, is the way he's mediating in this very open moment of coming out of the First World War. And here I really like this concept of Jørn Lenard. He has this concept of an overburdened peace, not necessarily because the peace comes at the same time. The interwar is very different geographically, but it's an interesting way of thinking about the actors that move into this at some point post-war reality, that they're negotiating and, as we said, betting on different horses, trying to maneuver in this space where they know there will be something on the other side, but they don't know quite what. And I can trace this with him, right? That he's initially in some sort of a broader Hellenist way of placing himself. He becomes more and more kind of a Venizelist in his language. Then he kind of takes on the Wilsonian language more wholeheartedly and distances himself from Greek politics, and becomes an internationalist of sorts, but a patriotic internationalist. And this leads me to think of all of these nationalists or patriots or whatever you want to call them, that they are in the molding of these new very muscular states that come out of the First World War, they're displaced. But they're displaced very different places. He ends up in the League in some sort of hybrid Greekness in a way, which I find quite fascinating. And I think there are all of these people with imaginations of, or these kind of horizons of possibilities coming out of the First World War that end up a lot of different places because they placed their bets on something that didn't materialize. And I think that's quite a fascinating way of looking at all these kind of figures that come out of that. My questions are perhaps a little bit, so that was just more of a thought, and my questions are perhaps a little bit related to that, but related to Agnidis's practice, because he places himself very carefully in this landscape through musical reviews and through reviews of books, reviews of poetry, these kind of things, to try to send out signals, at least that's how I interpret him, about what kind of figure he is to the Venizelos, to Constantinople Greeks, etc. And it's a very careful way of kind of phrasing. It's full of politics, but it's actually a musical review, for example. So
Where
I was
does
thinking,
he publish those? Sorry.
he publishes it in French musical reviews and British musical reviews, and then he becomes an official for the Greek embassy or in London, and starts to write for Le Méditerranée Orientale, where he actually contributes quite a lot of, I would say, literature review, basically, but where there is a lot of politics kind of baked into it all the time. So my question was about this humor and satire and the way of cloaking yet revealing your position, and whether you could talk a little bit about how Refik Khalid does this, because I find that quite fascinating, this kind of oppositional strategy of masking and revealing at the same time. It must have been a joy to read as well. So just thoughts on that would be very, very welcome.
Yeah, thank you. So first, I wanted to point out, when you're talking about these kind of exiled anti-national, or these people who are kind of displaced in this interwar period, and that I think is a fascinating topic overall. And just to bring it back to Dimitris bringing into the Greeks, there many members of the list of 150, not so much the intellectuals, but the religious and the military ones, ended up in Greece, in Thrace and in Crete. Eshref Kushubasha ended up in Crete. And actually, anyway, there's a whole coincidence that I discovered recently about him and what he left behind. That he was a painter. Actually, he did these kind of primitive but not so bad paintings that he left behind there. Anyway, so much for art and politics and intellectual work. The second thing too, on this idea of Agnidis also writing these musical reviews and kind of book reviews, thanks to Melike, who was here but had to leave, she wrote her dissertation on the Syllogos, the Philologikos Syllogos, right? The Philological Association of Constantinople, which was actually not just an association, it was like a whole academy of Athens, right? It was huge. And the intellectual life going on there is really remarkable from the 1860s on. And I feel like Agnidis is coming out of that tradition of, like, he's a statesman and a diplomat and an intellectual and a literature. Like that I think probably made a lot of sense in the world that he was coming from. And it's kind of fascinating to see it in that context. Maybe you already do look at it like that, but that's really great. And so for satire, yes, I guess the way I saw it was that, because he's poking fun, he even pokes fun of the liberals in the second constitutional period when he's still a young man. And so he is kind of poking fun at everyone. And I guess how I chose to frame it is that it's a way of articulating the contradictions of the moment. And it seemed that, I think that might be why satire was so popular at that moment, not because in the early, like 1908, 1909, maybe even 1910, it's not that it was like that risque to express dissent. It became more so soon, but it was more about finding a position from which to see both sides of a contradiction, right? And I loved reading the satire and the caricatures. I didn't look systematically at the caricatures, but some people have, and it's wonderful. You do get a whole other, it is very subversive, let's put it that way, if you put them all together and see. And I think Dimitri could probably speak to the Greek satirical life going on along in parallel, and there's another point of convergence, right? As you probably, the very same things are being expressed in those satires. So yeah, that's great.
Thank you very much, Christina. Did you have a last remark, Dimitris, or do you want to?
No, just something very quick. I'm not gonna take more time. I was just thinking, because you all brought it up, and I think you brought it up and Laura brought it up. I think one of the things that we should take into consideration is how all these different analytical terms touch upon each other. So in a sense, colonialism, post-Ottoman, internationalism, transnationalism, communalism. I mean, you refer to Agnidis, and we wrote that paper together about Agnidis and Spatharis and all these people who actually, I think that it's very difficult to separate these terms. I mean, what Or said, yes. I mean, post-Ottoman could not be seen outside of colonialism. It's impossible. Nationalism could not be seen within colonialism, within the post-Ottoman world. And the same with the League of Nations. I mean, the League of Nations come as an institution, and at the beginning, they are both against, but functions alongside colonialism. So in a sense, it's impossible. And one last remark, and I'll finish with that. The other time I was in a discussion about whether the Greek campaign in Asia Minor was part of colonialism, and yes, there is Greek nationalism, there is Greek irredentism, there are the unredeemed brothers there, but if it wasn't for British colonial interests, there's no way that the Greeks would have taken the permission to go to Smyrna. So therefore, I mean, it provides the platform, the political platform, that is. So therefore, I think that it's at some point we should have a discussion on these analytical terms and how these analytical terms complement each other and converse with each other.
Yeah, I fully agree. I just want to jump in because Laura, who was here, she's written a really recently published really excellent book on territorialism, which is a kind of a separate but intricately connected movement of the Zionist movement. And she got the same, let's say, problems handed to her by me, namely isms and interwar, and immediately she started to, unpack these terms: colonialism, internationalism, Zionism, and how they, intermeshed with that territorialist movement in ways that made it useful terms to excavate with, but not useful terms to label with. And I think that's quite important in a way, because like you said, with the League of Nations, let's take the mandate system as a whole. It's all of these things and none of these things at the same time, and it is in a continuous both dialogue but also contestation with the globally mobilized public who is trying to bend it, label it, force it to take on specific modalities. So it's really I think it's that in this way these terms are useful. They're useful as heuristic tools, but not as labels. So I think that's why the Muhalafet is such an interesting concept, right? Because it's it's a descriptor, and it's not, in a sense, and it's malleable, but it has some continuity to it. It brings out, to me at least, it brought out a very distinct form of thinking about liberalism, which I think also makes at least me, from not being an expert on that, made me think a lot about liberalism in liberal internationalism, and how malleable that category is, and how easy it is in some texts you read, to label, and how the prism of a person, because a person never moves the way you want them to move, but it can be an arc, to tell a really complicated story, forces you to kind of rethink, rehash, chronologize terms like that. And I think that's extremely useful. I mean, also for us, Dimitri, in terms of the 1923 project as well. So yeah, thanks for that, Christine. That wasn't really a question, just
No, that's great. I was also just going to add that on this question of whether the Greek expansion into Asia Minor was a colonial venture, the question of whether irredentism, right, which is only ever used in the case of Germany and Greece, I think. You don't see that word much, but whether irredentism is a form of colonialism, or is it colonialism in disguise, or is it really something different? Is it a way of expounding on or articulating what different visions of nationalism? So again, I think irredentism would be interesting to bring into that.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it links explicitly to the notion of something being lost and reclaimed, so it's kind of separates itself from colonialism in that way. But then in its practice, yes, exactly. But then in its practice, it might look quite the same, right, Dimitri? Yeah.
Yes.
Just one thing. Funny thing is that Kemal and the Republic of Turkey are doing that with Alexandretta later on.
Yes.
Which is they do exactly what they had condoned and they were saying Greece was doing. So in a sense, we see that where you have a population where you feel that there is a kind of ethno-national affinity, then you feel also that you have the right to claim that territory. Which
and
in
Cyprus.
a sense,
Not to mention Cyprus.
Yes, obviously, but true. But in a sense that the Alexandretta case is chronologically so close to 1922, where you're actually thinking, okay, I mean, you had just condemned that political behavior, and you do exactly the same thing.
Yes.
So in a sense,
Or did you want to?
I want to say for Dimitris, you said about League of Nations and post-Ottoman, but the mandate system, it was kind of post-Ottoman system, because they take the limited sovereignty for example, in Egypt, in Yemen and Bosnia, and copies this to Syria, Palestine,
and Lebanon, Syria. Yes, obviously, yes, true.
Yes.
Of course.
So as I think the post-Ottoman, it's very interesting term, because Mehmet Akif, all the time I come back to Mehmet Akif, for example, but he continued to write in Ottoman Turkish and published his last book in Ottoman Turkish in 1932 in Egypt. So as it's the Ottoman culture, as this is the reason I think about the post-Ottoman or post-imperial order, if you want. It's not Ottoman. It's...
Now, or said that, and I have to add one last comment, because funny thing is that the first thing that Steriadis, the High Commissioner in Smyrna, is doing, he's asking for the plan of the mandate for Syria and Lebanon. It hasn't been voted yet, it hasn't been passed yet, but still he's asking for that plan, because he's thinking, what's the best way of managing and governing all these people in what was supposed to be an Ionian state or being part of Greece? And then he says, okay, only in a post-Ottoman manner. So in a sense, it is exactly what you said, or that this is what they have on the ground, and this is how they're trying to, reform it, but still keep the basics there. which is it's a kind of post-Ottoman system.
Of course, yeah. Very interesting. Yeah.
You want to have the last word, Christine, or on these things?
I will leave it to you,
All
Hakan
right.
and Dimitri, and or.
Well, then I have to say this was it ended up being a very intimate and very nice conversation, I have to say, and
Very interesting.
yeah, absolutely, very interesting, and for me an
Discussion.
absolute joy to listen to both you, Christine, and to you, Dimitri, and a lot of food for thought for work coming, I think, in the next several years. Yeah, I guess I only have to say thank you to both of you and to all of you for showing up, and the rest
Thank
who
you
were
very
here
much.
at some point.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah, and see you all soon.
See you.
Yes, thank you so much for organizing, and thank you.
And have a nice
Dimitri.
evening. Here it's a night, so have a nice day. Yeah. Yes,
Exactly.
in Israel,
I'm
it's
going to
night now.
teach. I'm going off to teach my class. So have a nice evening, everyone.
Take
Well,
care.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.